Corbyn averts his face whenever he hears the word Jew and rolls his eyes whenever he is asked a question, because he fears the chaos, otherwise known as a change of mind, that might ensue from accepting there's another way of looking at the world. I will spend my remaining seconds, I don't mean in life, I mean of this speech, telling you why it matters to everyone, not just Jews, that a man so spiteful, sanctimonious and obdurate should never be allowed to do to the country what he's doing to the party. Those who revere Corbyn see it as a virtue that he has never changed his views. Mr. Chairman, it is only a virtue to be faithful to one's views if those views are worth staying faithful to. To persist in a small erroneousness is the mark of a fool. To persist in a great erroneousness is the mark of a dangerous fool. The ideology in which Corbyn has been pickled for half a century was outworn before it even reached him. It oversaw the death of millions. That the ideologies he opposes have scarcely done any better is not an argument for his. You don't have to love the West to refuse the embraces of those whose sole ambition is to blow the West apart, especially if you wish to call yourself a pacifist. This should have been a golden summer for Labour. The nightmare that is Brexit, the hell that is Jacob Rees-Mogg, the out-of-season pantomime that is Boris Johnson. From all these, Labour ought to have delivered us. But Corbyn did as much as anyone to make Brexit happen with his feeble non-support for remaining. Do you remember that question? How much do you favour staying? 7.5%. That was one to get us to the barricades, was it not, ladies and gentlemen? The wrong man, ladies and gentlemen, the wrong man in the wrong time, espousing the wrong causes. I am nothing if not fair. People who are limited in everything but the pleasure they take in themselves are ten a penny in all political parties. They haunt the peripheries like ghosts of the Christmases they don't believe in past, backing losing causes, throwing tea parties for murderers, and looking saintly. Mr. Corbyn's misfortune was to be lifted from those peripheries and dumped haplessly in the centre. Ladies and gentlemen, not just for our sake, but for his, for theirs. Will someone please have pity and dump him back? Thank you.
Now, in terms of the anti-Semitism issue, you would think, well, maybe this is hopeful. Maybe this is a hopeful sign that the public have kind of, saw Corbyn as being kind of the nexus point of leftist anti-Semitism at its worst. And they rejected him. They saw the problem, they rejected him, and in some ways maybe Corbyn gave most of the public a kind of a warning sign about how anti-Semitic the left truly are. They kind of prepared us for what was to come after October the 7th. It'd be nice to think so. I'd like to think so. But I'm just not so sure now. I mean, there were warning signs obviously before October the 7th that the Islamic anti-Semitism was becoming, in Britain, was becoming far more brazen. There was an incident in Tower Hamlets back in 2021 during another one of those Israel-Gaza wars. Mohammed Hijab was there, Ali Dawah was there, these kind of YouTube Islamist scumbags.
Fuck them infants, fuck all of them, fuck their mothers, fuck their daughters, and show them support for Palestine. Shut them up, rape their daughters, if you have to send a message like that.
This nasty radicals kind of thing, went to the streets under police protection, being kind of approved by the police to demonstrate, and there were Muslims in cars with megaphones and Palestinian flags yelling into their megaphones, fuck the Jews, rape their daughters, and they went into Tower Hamlets, they're filming themselves going into Tower Hamlets. We're going to find some Jews. We're going to get some Jews.
The issue we have in the UK is we have a significant minority of people who openly support what Hamas did, and we are importing more of those people every day.
The 50,000 people that I saw marching, how many of those people are immigrants and how many aren't?
I have no idea. Nobody does. None of us know what percentage of those people actually support Hamas and what percentage of those people just think Palestinians are being badly treated. We don't know. But what we do know is there are some among them who support what Hamas did, and the police refuse to do anything about it. Hamas is a proscribed terrorist organization in the UK, which means that if you express public support for Hamas, you should be arrested and, in my opinion, deported. Right? That's not going to happen. The last time there was a flare-up, so to speak, in the Middle East, we had people who drove down for hours from a different city to London, to Jewish areas of London, with Palestine flags and screamed using megaphones, "Fuck Jewish women, rape Jewish women, kill Jews." Those people were not prosecuted for what they did, even though it is the law of the land that they should be.
Why were they not prosecuted?
Not enough evidence.
It was on tape. I saw
it. It was on camera.
Yeah.
So the mayor of New York stands up and gives a speech saying, "I am your brother, I stand with Israel." The mayor of London stands up and says, "Diversity is our strength."
Which to me was the first real sign that we had been completely abandoned. The British public and the Jewish community together, we've been abandoned by the police, who had just completely capitulated to the mob of Islamist savages that none of us wanted these scum in our country. None of us wanted those scum here. But the police were having to appease them and accommodate them. And we're allowing them to get away with murder, frankly. And that was the first sign that the police had been completely ideologically captured. I don't know how this happened under a Tory government. That's been the biggest baffling mystery of all. But I don't understand it, if you know what I mean. You could probably explain it to me, but I don't think I'll ever understand it.
The first thing that a serious incoming Conservative government has to do, quite simply, is to repeal the whole of the legislation of New Labour, the setting up of the Supreme Court, the incorporation of the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act, all have to be repealed. Because again, can we get this quite clear? Human rights sounds lovely and cuddly. The left has perverted language. Human rights are not cuddly because human rights have been perverted. They're now designed to protect minorities against the majority. Human rights, this is why Churchill would not have approved. It's constantly, the left constantly says, this is Churchill's creation. Churchill created human rights, mistakenly in my view, or created the idea of the European Convention to protect the individual against the state. If instead you decide that the purpose of human rights is to protect the minority against the majority, you can only do that by an aggressive state that limits the freedom of the individual, as we see catastrophically with the limits with the attempted limits on the freedom of speech. That absolutely central thing.
I mean, if you try and make the argument that what they are creating through mass immigration, by failing to control the borders, by pandering to, let's say, radical, if not extreme groups, they're creating a very divided, low-trust society. That's exactly what New Labour did, by the way. Much of this goes back to New Labour and the legal architecture that they put in to Britain's political system. A lot of this, I think, goes back to the Human Rights Act, the Equalities Act, the Supreme Court, New Labour's kind of insistence that supranational institutions like the European Union and others should always dominate and be supreme over our national law and over ourselves as a sovereign, self-guiding nation. And if you look at the legacy of things like the Human Rights Act or the European Convention on Human Rights, which has a longer lineage, that's why we can't control our borders. So we're now getting at the point where neither Labour nor the Conservatives will commit to overturning any of that stuff. And so by extension, they won't commit to controlling our own borders. I mean, the only people who will are Nigel Farage and the Reform Party. So that is the clearest dividing line that we now have in British politics between what you might call the uniparty that is indistinguishable on a lot of these issues and Farage and Reform.
David Starkey has explained how it's just the legislation, the Equality Act. It just gives power to groups over individuals, and so it basically allows ethnic minority communities to rule by the power of the mob, and it privileges some ethnic communities over others. And unfortunately, it's one in which the Muslims win out and the Jews lose out. Because increasingly we are ceding more and more power to the authoritarian left, who are taking over the institutions, taking over the establishment, and it's getting worse. And we're seeing that they are far from the figures of tolerance and multicultural understanding, that they do have a massive anti-Semitic streak to them. And a massive anti-Semitic agenda to them. There's only a massive anti-Zionist agenda to them.
I'm an optimistic person, despite this past week. And I remain extremely hopeful that this week can be a watershed moment in finally opening people's eyes to the absolute illiberalism of this worldview. You have to ask yourself, what kind of worldview would let people see the massacre that we have just witnessed and justify it, or explain it, or remain silent in the face of it? It's an ideology that says people that oppressors, and we can discuss whether or not Israel are the oppressors in the situation of the Middle East, they deserve it. They had it coming to them. That this is what decolonization looks like.
Mm-hmm. I'm not an expert on the politics of Israel and Palestine, but it is also deeply unsurprising to me seeing what's happening in Palestine. The instinct here, given the complexity, is to see things in terms of this is horrific, what's happened to Israel. But when you all examined colonization and decolonizing, what did you actually think that would look like?
But then of course October the 7th happened. It should have drawn the world in sympathy with the Jewish community and with Israel, and yet somehow it brought all the anti-Semitic sewer creatures to the fore somehow. Now, why did it happen? Now, it kind of revealed how embedded the anti-Semitic left were in the media, in social media, and in the universities especially. The worst sign we saw of this was the recent Oxford debate, where there was a disturbing moment where Mossab Hassan Youssef gave a speech in which he kind of challenged his audience. If you'd been basically a Palestinian who knew about, that the Hamas were plotting a terrorist attack, a suicide bombing attack, or an October the 7th attack, and you could get that information to the authorities to warn them what was about to happen and prevent it, to save human lives, would you do it? And 75% of the crowd said no, they wouldn't, that they'd allow it to happen.
I am sentenced by my father to death He made my blood allowed. Why? Because I reported on suicide bombing attacks that targeted civilians indiscriminately. This is my crime. And guess what? It is not a secret that you discovered. It was my initiative that I revealed myself to public of what I did, because I am not ashamed of saving human lives. You should be ashamed for taking the side of terrorists. Now, how many of you sitting here want to teach me a lesson about morality? If you knew about October 7 attacks, any of you, raise your hands. If you had information about Hamas attack on October 7, would you report it to the authorities? If you do, raise your hand. Sit down. Less than 5% in this room raised their hands that they would report a massive terrorist attack that targeted civilians indiscriminately. That includes Arabs, Muslims, Jews, Christians, peaceful farming communities on October 7.
That itself tells me that the country is facing, potentially, our country has a serious problem. If these are our future thought leaders, if these are future leaders being kind of taught at Oxford, then our country could be facing a serious crisis, a serious potential civil war, if this is how sociopathic and malicious the line of thought is on the leftist establishment of the future. I am very, very pessimistic about the future of Britain if that's our future, if those are our future leaders. Now, why did October the 7th lead to this, though? Well, I think there's two reasons. Firstly, the anti-Israeli left were prepared for it. They were prepared to sabotage the narrative right from the get-go, in the most shameful and disgraceful way.
The military solutions that have been pursued against the Gaza Strip have led to huge bloodshed.
You don't think they have the right to defend themselves?
I think a military attack on Gaza will lead to countless dead Israeli soldiers and huge numbers of civilian deaths.
They should allow the hostages to die.
And I have to say, Margaret, when you said, please, it's very difficult to have a conversation if you just speak over each other. I don't think it's that nice to watch.
Because you make me really angry because you're using this horror.
No, Margaret,
I'm going to come in. I am actually going to come in. Okay, right. I'm going to come in.
October the 7th was a huge news story. It was so shocking and so horrific that it filled the news, it filled social media, and the left were ready to hijack the narrative there and then. They were ready to fill the threads with their propaganda about the plight of the Palestinians, about the horrors of the occupation, about the horrors of the Nakba. Now, the Nakba, I think, is kind of crucial here, and it really does show how this left-wing idea of decolonising the curriculum in academia has really kind of translated into the Palestinian cause, and how it really has led to a kind of a new left-wing anti-Semitism. Because, the Holocaust, the Nakba rather, happened 3 years after the World War II ended. After the world discovered the concentration camps, discovered the Holocaust. And I mean the world discovered it. The world leaders, of course, knew about it as it was happening. The world saw the horrors and was reeling from the horrors. They couldn't believe what was happening in Germany, that such horrors were possible. such human horrors were possible. Now the Nakba, whichever way you spin it, whether it was a civil war, where you want to spin it as a civil war, as a colonial invasion, as two warring sides committing war crimes against each other, both sides being as bad as each other, but the Israelis won. So many different accounts, and so many different biased accounts exist. Bottom line is, the Nakba was probably not a significant world event in the minds of most people at the time. It was dwarfed by the Holocaust, absolutely. The Nakba was absolutely dwarfed by the Holocaust.
There were Arabs standing between Lud and Ramle and crying. They want to get back to their homes, and I could do nothing. And I felt very strongly about it because I saw them standing there, no shoes, and now they have to start walking and looking for someplace else. Then came the night, and at night, I don't know how many, 15 or 16 or maybe 10, I can't remember, trucks full of people that just came on the ship from the Holocaust. And they took over the town in 5 minutes. And so the whole tragedy was there in one moment. Here are the Arabs who used to live there, and here people who come from the Auschwitz and Majdanek and all that, and they won, they took the city. And the Arabs had to go to Nablus and to Jenin and it's not that it's right or wrong, but it's just a fact.
No one could look at the horrors of the Holocaust and be swayed at all to what was happening in Palestine. And like I said, Israel-Palestine, it was a far less bloody partition than the Indian-Pakistan partition.
The whole idea of Zionism, of the creation of a Jewish state, was deeply unpopular in Europe and among most European Jews before 1939. Very few of them were persuaded of it. They thought it was a bad idea. They could see the problems of moving Jews into an area which was already inhabited by Arabs. There was already a large Jewish settlement in what was then the British Mandate of Palestine, but not a nation. But after the death camps were opened in 1945, even the most obdurate opponents of the Zionist program of creating a Jewish state in the Middle East, even they gave up. They said there has to be somewhere to go. Most people don't know the record of the civilized nations of the world in the period before 1939. They don't know how they simply closed their doors to Jewish refugees from Nazi persecution. Even worse, they don't know that Britain was one of the most foremost in closing those doors because Britain controlled migration to what was then its colonial possession, the Palestine Mandate. And in 1939, having promised to create a national home for the Jews, pretty much ended Jewish migration to that part of the world. 1939, this was after the terrible events of what most people will have heard of, Kristallnacht, in November 1938, when the German government openly sponsored a murderous pogrom against the Jews of Germany. You could not have been in any doubt in May 1939, when we started shutting down Jewish migration to Palestine, you could not have been in any doubt of the dangers of the Jews of Europe from Nazi Germany, and yet we closed it. And it's the most extraordinary event. But this was general at the time. And so but people changed their minds. And so that is, Israel doesn't exist for any other reason than that.
I think for a long time most people didn't even know about the Nakba, what the Nakba was. I think most people they knew there was a conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and most people probably went their lives never knowing how the conflict even started. When the Nakba happened, I think no one really, I don't think it entered kind of popular, opinion in Britain, in the West. Very few people knew about the Nakba, I think. I mean, the first time I became even aware of the Nakba was when I saw a play called The Shroud Maker. Me and my mum were going to see it together. We didn't end up seeing it together, but I did get the the play, and it tells the story of this old Palestinian woman who's she's a shroud maker in Gaza, and she is having flashbacks to her life story. This old Palestinian woman in Gaza who sews she's a seamstress who sews kind of shrouds for the martyrs. Every time there's a war in Gaza. And the play is basically her reminiscing on her life in Palestine, and her memories. There's kind of her memories in childhood of being under the British mandate, British colonialism, and it does include the Nakba. She's kind of a young 14-year-old girl when the Nakba happened. It's like prior to then she was being kind of there was this British colonial, this British middle class woman who had kind of taken a liking to her. I think she was a teacher or something, and she said, I think I'll take you and father to see London. It's be wonderful there. You'll love it there. But then, of course, the British pulled out, and the Nakba happened, and it fades to black, and she wakes up in the morning. And there's all kinds of corpses everywhere. There's been massacres, and she ends up adopting this abandoned baby, and it's like, she describes at one point before the Nakba happens, this English teacher, this woman who kind of takes a fondness to her and her father, and says, I'd quite like to invite you with me sometime to London to see the wondrous sights of London in Britain. And it doesn't happen because the British pull out and the Nakba happens. Like, basically the stage goes black. You hear all these kind of garbled news reports in the background, and she kind of awakes to find there's been a massacre. There's been, the country's in chaos, and she goes out and the streets are strewn with dead bodies, with dead Palestinians, and her father's dead, among the dead, and she finds this abandoned baby that she basically adopts, and it's like she can't understand what's happened to the country. She can't understand, she's kind of can't make sense of the chaos that's happened. It's kind of poignant. It's like, the life that could have been, and her growing up not knowing what the hell's going on in her country, why this is all happening to them. And that was my first kind of glimpse of the Nakba. I became more aware of the Nakba during this kind of, the many fights on social media, because there was, threads were being kind of filled with kind of, clips from the Tantora documentary, and, so many other documentaries on the Nakba and on the occupation. And basically the Palestinian activists kind of filled the propaganda into the threads very, very quickly to make clear Israel was the aggressors, and that October the 7th was blowback, or certainly that October the 7th wasn't where this began. And I think because of that, it made a lot more people suddenly aware of the Nakba and the Palestinian cause in a way they never had before, and so as a result, the Palestinian the Free Palestine movement has had a huge, major boost.
Ladies, gentlemen, and respective elders, I'm extremely honoured to be with you here today. It's obviously a difficult and critical time, but even more important that we are here together, united in our campaign for peace and justice everywhere around the world. My name is Leanne Mohammed, and I'm a British Palestinian born and raised in London. Today, I speak to you all as a Palestinian granddaughter of 1948 Nakba survivors. Nakba meaning our Palestinian catastrophe in Arabic. And today, it pains me to see another Nakba unfolding right in front of our eyes in 2023. In the past, we believed that if there was access to the internet and digital media in 1948 like today, Palestinians could live stream the Nakba in real time, and the international community would have intervened to prevent it. But my grandparents would not be refugees. They would still be living in their homes in Palestine. How silly we were, because it's never been about a lack of evidence. It's about it's about the very refusal to see us Palestinians as human beings.
She gave this speech in which she talked about the Nakba and how her parents had suffered the Nakba, and said, if social media had existed back then people would have been horrified at the Nakba. And this kind of became the recurring theme of the pro-Palestine camp, is they would actually show clips from documentaries like Tantora and Creation Catastrophe, 1948 Creation Catastrophe, that showed the massacres in Deir Yassin and Tantora. And it was like in a soundbite where they could show, this is how Palestine was taken. And a lot of people didn't quite understand that. They understood there was a conflict. They didn't know quite how it started. And this was telling them this is how it started. And, it started with Israel. It was almost like framing it as Israel started it. Never let them tell you October the 7th started it. And I think because of that, it made a lot more people suddenly aware of the Nakba and the Palestinian cause in a way they never had before. And so, as a result, the Palestinian, the Free Palestine movement has had a huge, major boost, an incredible boost, off the back of October the 7th, which, to my mind, is the most horrifying thing. However right or wrong, their propaganda, the fact is, it is sickening to me that October the 7th could have had any kind of a positive reward for the Palestinian cause. That itself utterly sickens me. It horrifies me. But it's the miserable truth that it has happened. Even kind of Candace Owens has said, that she never took interest in the Israel-Palestine issue until October the 7th, and that's when she looked. And she said, she challenged Rabbi Shmuley on this. She said, some of us looked and did not like what we saw.
Look, prior to October 7th, I don't think many people were engaged with what is happening in Israel. We kind of all said the same thing. Israel is our friend and ally. I count myself among those people. Post October 7th, the world, and especially I would say Zionists in media, were demanding that we all pay attention. And when we began to pay attention, we didn't like what we saw. You cannot tell me to ever feel comfortable with 18,000 children being ruthlessly murdered. You can't get me to feel comfortable as a Christian with the amount of more explosives dropped, tons of explosives dropped on Gaza than were dropped in Hiroshima.
Now, the other problem, of course, is that with the growth of the Palestine movement and with the horrors of the war that we're seeing on social media, Problem Being once said this to me. He said that I was on a stream with him on Dave Travels Through Time's channel, and he said to me that he's made objection to social justice warriors and the woke agenda in Doctor Who now, is that there's a kind of sinister agenda to these woke activists. They want control. They want to brainwash the youth. They're basically control freaks. But he says that the thing about them is that they kind of shroud themselves in having some kind of noble, virtuous cause of equality, and the problem is you cannot oppose them. You cannot be seen to oppose them on their sinister agenda without being seen to oppose the virtue itself of equality, and so basically you cannot oppose their agenda without being branded a misogynist, racist, this or that, the other. It is the same thing when it comes to the pro-Palestine movement. We know that there is a sinister pro-Hamas agenda to the pro-Palestine movement. We know there's a sinister anti-Semitism to the pro-Palestine movement. But they posture as though their virtue is about saving Palestinian children from the horrors of the war and saving them from Zionist baby killers and this and that and the other. And that basically you cannot be seen to oppose them without opposing the humanitarian cause itself. and being in favour of killing Palestinian children and being an evil Zionist.
And can I ask you what your view is of the events of October the 7th? What do you think happened on October the 7th in Israel?
Well, obviously the camps haven't started because of October the 7th specifically. Right. They're starting, I mean, this week in loads of encampments up and down the country. They've been like celebrating and having to like memorise the fact that this week commemorates the Nakba, which took place 76 years ago, which means catastrophe, which is a massive symbol of what Israel has been doing for the last 76 years. This isn't about October the 7th. And to start with that is just entirely disingenuous, I think, on your part. I really want to say that I think it's great, actually, that you went to that camp today and tried to talk to those students. And you kind of embarrassed yourself, I would say, whilst doing that, because it was a reminder for me, and I'm sure for other people watching, that actually the Palestine movement brought you down, and the Palestine movement has the potential to bring down lots of other Tory ministers and the whole Tory government, and not just the Tory government, I would say any government and any mainstream political party that is backing what Israel is doing right now, which is a genocide, and that's what people want to protest.
Do you want to come back to that? Bringing down the government. Well, so you're saying your encampment has nothing to do with the events of October the 7th or Israel's response to October the 7th? Is that what you're saying? It's totally detached to October the 7th and Israel's response?
The only thing that is detached, I would say, is actually your views and your approach to this whole situation and the whole of the Tory government. The people, the student protesters, are very attached to what is happening in Palestine, and they are doing what they can in order to stop universities who provide, I think, £450 million to the Israeli state, to the Israeli military, rather than investing in their own education and what they should be putting money into. You are the one, and your government is completely out of touch with what actually the majority of people in Britain think about what's happening. The majority of people in Britain do not support what Israel is doing and actually want us to stop sending weapons. And you were saying today that we should send more, which is completely opposed to what people in Britain actually want. So I think you're detached.
Right, so on arms. So can I ask you, what's your view of Hamas?
I don't want to talk about Hamas. I want to talk about why. And the reason that you want to talk about Hamas is because you want to keep justifying spending more money for Israel, right? Sunak earlier, a month or two ago, was talking about increasing defence spending to 2.5%. They want to spend loads of money on that, but no money on the NHS, no money on education. You want to cut pensions, you want to cut council budgets. That's what the government that you support is doing, which is causing serious suffering in this country as well. So
this is not to do with Hamas, it's not to do with Israel. It's about the Conservative government. Is this an anti-Conservative?
You're bringing up Hamas. Of course we're anti-Conservative because the Conservative government is facilitating and supporting a genocide. And not just that, it's also overseeing a horrific set of policies, austerity policies, that are damaging everyone's lives in Britain today.
Okay.
And I am 100% 10 toes down anti-Israel. I believe Israel has no right to exist. I believe the United States has no right to exist. I believe every settler colony who has committed genocide against native peoples, against indigenous people, has no right to exist. I believe in a free Palestine. From the river to the sea. Y'all are the demons. Y'all are the villains. We've been trying to end y'all. Get free of y'all.
As the war on Gaza has unfolded over the past 100 days, one of the shocking things that we have seen is Israelis flying in from all over the globe to join the IDF. Whilst countries like South Africa offered warnings against their citizens in travelling to Palestine and joining the massacre on the Gaza Strip, countries like the UK and France have seen sometimes near thousands of their citizens flying off to join the IDF. This brings us to the case of Levi Simon. Levi Simon is one of the many British Israelis who has taken off to go and fight for the IDF.
We're talking about Gaza. We're talking about Levi Simon, that terrorist that's come back from, Gaza.
A British charity called the Boys Club in northwest London was set to host a British-Israeli dual national called Levi Simon. You may know him from this clip.
Inside of Gaza, exotic laundry that you...
and that clip.
Gaza waving an Israeli flag in one of their schools where they teach terrorism. So,
but the event was cancelled, and here are some of the interesting things that we saw outside the venue.
That this so-called charity have the audacity to invite a man, a British man, who glorified his participation in the genocide of Gaza.
I mean, how did this happen? Because I do think that at the beginning of this war, on October the 7th, I think a huge amount of the population probably was drawn to sympathy with Israel after the October the 7th massacre horrors were revealed. They were horrified, and rightly so.
What do you make of MPs, SMPs, some 56 Labour MPs, 10 from the front bench, who've now lost those jobs on the Labour front bench, most of it, by the way, no one had ever heard of, basically defying Keir Starmer and indeed Conservative policy, which is not to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. They called for a ceasefire. They say that is the humanitarian, the right thing to do. What do you make of that vote?
There was a ceasefire, and it was broken by Hamas on the 7th of October. When they killed 1,400 Israelis and kidnapped 240, when they led to scenes like the one you saw there. I can't stress enough that people in the kibbutz, people in these communities, you see even on the remainders of their house, on their fridge magnets, peace now, live and let live. These were people who wanted to live by their Gazan neighbors, and often cooperated, drove people to hospital. There's a funeral today of an 80-year-old woman who drove Palestinian children to hospitals. She was an Israeli. She was killed by Hamas. Her funeral is today. They couldn't identify the body until just a few days ago. She was so badly burned. I can't stress enough, a ceasefire would return to the situation that led to this. People like that man you just saw me interviewing, he said to me at the end of our interview, he said, I'm a leftist. I've always been a leftist. He said, we cannot live beside these people, by which he and all the others mean we cannot live beside Hamas. Hamas has said that they will do this again and again. There is no way anyone can live beside that. What that looks like, what the defeat of Hamas looks like, we'll see. But a ceasefire is not the answer to that. And anyone who thinks otherwise should come here and learn something.
Yeah, the news reports coming out were horrifying. And I think the average member of the public probably was on Israel's side. But over the course of the year, I think that's changed. And more and more people seem to be speaking against Israel. More and more politicians are speaking against Israel because they feel, there's public pressure on them to say you've gone too, Israel is going too far now.
We started with a moment's silence for what's happening in Gaza. The killing of people on October the 7th was wrong and appalling. That act of terror that took lives of 1,400 people. Israel's response of bombing in Gaza has now taken 11,000 lives. Just as I was coming here this morning, I heard that the Israeli Armed Forces, the IDF, has instructed everyone to leave Al-Shifa Hospital within 1 hour. A hospital, everybody's got to go. There's nowhere to go, and told them to go westwards towards the beach. This is unbelievable. We're watching in real time the destruction of life, the destruction of what passes for a public service system in Gaza, and more killing is going on. When the General Secretary of the United Nations says there is disaster, there is famine, there is death coming even worse to Gaza now, surely to goodness every government in the world should recognize that and say to Israel, stop, make sure there is a ceasefire that can bring about a long-term peace and a long-term justice. You can invade, you can control, you can kill, you can maim, but the bitterness goes on for decades and decades and decades. Peace is never easy to achieve. You've got to start somewhere, which is why I was so disgusted by the failure of our parliament in London to vote the very minimal thing of asking for an immediate ceasefire and ceasing the supply of arms to Israel, to encourage them to sign that as well.
I think the people felt that they were hoping that Israel would win the war quickly, and defeat Hamas and get the hostages back. The longer the war has gone on, the less hopeful people are about that end being achieved. The less hopeful people are that there even is an end, in that there is even a positive end to this war, that it actually is serving any purpose other than just, as they say, collective punishment, just making things hellish for the Gazan people. What is Israel achieving here? They've not won the war. They're just causing more and more suffering to the Gazan people, and in the age of social media we're seeing the results of this. This is kind of the sneaky, nasty trap of this, of course. Hamas filmed what they did on October the 7th. They filmed the horrors they did. But they probably also knew that in terms of mainstream media, what they filmed was unbroadcastable. And so a huge chunk of the population wouldn't even know how horrific October the 7th was. Whereas the public would see on Twitter the horrors of what's happening in Gaza with, the bomb buildings and children being rushed to hospital and children starving, and all these war horrors. Horrific stuff that, happens in every war, but it's never been as filmed as this.
What is happening in Palestine can no longer be described as genocide. It is even beyond mass extermination. It is total erasure. How do I begin in telling you the feelings of living in a world where Palestinian suffering has become so normalized? Where the idea of a ceasefire to stop the killing of your people 42 days in remains a controversial topic for world leaders. Where all of this is on film, never having been more clearly documented, the death toll is now over 12,000, and we still have politicians justifying this. A world where we cannot mourn our dead because we are too busy convincing the world that a genocide is taking place.
There is suddenly more kind of pressure. I mean, I hope that the war would be won quickly, because I didn't necessarily approve of every strategy in the war. I didn't necessarily approve of cutting water and power to Gaza, knowing it would affect hospitals, it would affect hospital incubators. So I was hoping the war would be won quickly on those grounds of, hopefully if it's won quickly, the power gets turned back on again. And Hamas are defeated, win-win all round kind of thing.
They are justified. Israel is 100% justified in using any means necessary to defend their territory. And when it comes right down to it, that water, that electricity is easy to turn back on if the hostages were relinquished. But that's not what's happening. And oh, by the way, that 25% of supposed people who don't support Hamas, where are they in bringing hostages back? Where are they in the outcry of this?
Even I've not found it easy to completely stand with Israel throughout this. There have been moments of doubt. My video, The Darkness on Left, was about those moments of doubt, and about, the more I kind of learned about the conflict, the more I maybe wasn't sure I could side with Israel entirely.
Where Human Rights Watch in the last couple of days has made a similar allegation, and they have said that they believe the crime of extermination and genocide is made out because Israel has restricted water to the Gaza Strip. That is also palpably false. And in fact, COGAT, which is the unit of the IDF that is responsible for the provision of humanitarian assistance in times of armed conflict, today tweeted in response to that baseless accusation, detail on the level of the millions of cubic meters, or however it is that you measure water, that has been provided via Israel through 3 water pipes into Gaza through Israeli territory, some of which were attacked by Hamas on the 7th of October. So Israel has repaired those pipes and other water installations and continued to supply the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. Also Hamas. We can't avoid the fact that when Israel provides water, humanitarian assistance, food aid into the Gaza Strip, much of it, unfortunately, is diverted to Hamas, but Israel provides it anyway because it takes its humanitarian responsibilities very seriously.
But the bottom line for me is, in that time, I've come to know Israelis on Twitter who are living through this war, and I've come to think of them as friends, as people, as neighbours, as people I have to stand with. And they're facing an existential threat from Hamas and from Hezbollah and from Iran and from the UN, frankly, who have been proven to have, this nasty shared agenda of wanting to see Israel dismantled and vulnerable to being annihilated by its enemies. The UN just hates Israel. As a collective, it does. Because as a collective, it's largely predominated by nasty, vindictive dictatorships in the East.
To really understand the truth of this issue, you have to understand that, and this is what it takes people a while to get their heads around. It is possible that the entire world can conspire against a group of people. And if you don't think that's possible, then how has it happened so many times? Do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Like, even if you talk about just, Nazi Germany, for example, right? How is it possible that England, Poland, Germany, Spain, Russia, the Middle East, all the Arab countries, Morocco, Tunisia, Iraq, everyone conspired against the Jews at that period of time? And you find it so hard to believe that could still be the case, to the extent that it was a mass extermination, That's how far the propaganda and the anti-Semitism went. But you find it so hard to believe that the New York Times is lying to you,
So that's why I've stuck by Israel throughout this. And because the more I've looked into the news, the more I know that there's just a huge chunk of stuff that the most of the left do not know about. Most of the British public do not know about how bad it is in Israel. About what they're under threat from.
I've lost count of the number of people who write to me after I've written one of my blog posts. And they've said, I can't believe it. What you've written, I've never heard before. For example, I didn't know that there were so many rockets. I didn't know there were any rockets.
Really? They're not aware that Hamas had fired 12,000 rockets at the Israeli home front in this war.
The media that I'm reading doesn't tell me. I didn't realize that the ordinary Palestinians have been educated or brainwashed over all these years by the Palestinian Authority. No one has told us that. Ever. No one has ever told us that the Jews are the indigenous people of the land. I thought that after the Holocaust, the Jews had been kind of parachuted in from Europe. No one's ever told us this. Now, why haven't they been told? Okay, so...
And it's interesting you say that, because one of the challenges that I confront as a spokesman is that sometimes there is such a massive gulf between what is being reported in the Western media and the story that we tell, that I go on air and I sound like a madman because I am saying things that are being not only not amplified, but actively denied by a whole alphabet soup of UN agencies and human rights organizations, that simply to shift the story towards what is really happening here on the ground. I sound like I'm coming from way outside of the Overton window.
It's extremely difficult in a situation of crisis like this, where you are necessarily being put in a position of being on the defensive. You have an aggressive BBC Sky interviewer saying, why are you killing all these Gazan children? And you have to say, we're not killing them because this is why we're fighting a just war. The problem goes much further back.
Well, we don't deny that civilians tragically are being killed in this war, but we say there is an address for that. And that address is the terrorist organization that launched this war, that decided to fight this war from inside and under civilian areas. And we're doing everything we can to minimize harm to civilians without much help, unfortunately, from the UN agencies that are supposed to be protecting them. They've been very resistant to our efforts to keep civilians protected.
Indeed, you do say that, but you're coming in, what I'm saying is you're coming into a situation in which the ground, unfortunately, has already been prepared for you. And it's ground that you don't stand on, because without falling into a terrible deep hole, because the British people have been led to believe over many years that the people who drive the agenda in the Middle East are the Israelis.
So that's part of the issue, but on top of that, I think the point where the public opinion changed, the turning point for me was the ceasefire. About 2 or 3 months into the war, there was a ceasefire, and it was a ceasefire in which Hamas released a number of the hostages. They released some 100 of the hostages. And I think the release of the hostages changed public opinion on the war. And they, in some ways, it even kind of changed the perception of October the 7th and of Hamas. You know, it looked like Hamas had done a good deed, and that they'd shown that the prisoners they kept were unharmed, the hostages they kept were unharmed and were released. And it was a reminder that October the 7th hadn't just been a total massacre, that there had been people that Hamas had spared, took into Gaza, and had, well, kept alive, certainly. And it almost seemed to lessen the horror of October the 7th, and because, of course, the worst horrors of October the 7th weren't shown on mainstream media, people began to think of October the 7th as less of a pogrom and more as an operation to, and more as a political act to force Israel to accede to certain demands. And it made clear that Hamas had demands. They had demands to release its prisoners. You know, they had goals in mind. They had demands that could be negotiated.
17,000 kids dead.
Because of Hamas, my friend.
No.
Hamas.
Hamas are the resistance.
No. Where's the hostages at? Where's the hostages at? Where's the hostages at?
They're in Israeli prison.
Could you guys not get so aggressive with me? I'm by myself here.
You're assaulting me.
Look at these people. Where are the hostages? Why are they supporting hostage takers? Where are the hostages?
Where are the child bombers? Hostages are in prisons. 8,000 of them.
Where's the hostages, you scumbags?
And it made the ceasefire seem desirable. So it made Hamas seem less of an evil, and it made Israel seem like, once the fighting resumed, Israel suddenly seemed like the unreasonable aggressor that didn't even understand, didn't even seem to care about getting its own hostages back when it could negotiate for them. And because of that, opinion began to turn against Israel, and Gaza just seemed to be, it kind of turned it into a David and Goliath situation where, you know, Israel was Goliath punishing Hamas, punishing the Gaza Strip. And obviously the reports coming out, you know, were getting more and more insane, outlandish. You know, the reports coming out from Gaza were more horrifying. Some were possible, some I think have been fabricated by the Gaza Ministry of Health and by corrupt NGOs. I don't trust a lot of the information that's coming out of Gaza. I just don't. There were specific tragedies, of course, that happened as well. And ultimately there was and then, of course, South Africa got involved and brought its genocide case against Israel.
There is no indication at all that Israel accepts responsibility for rebuilding what it has destroyed. Instead, the destruction is celebrated by the Israeli army. Soldiers film themselves joyfully detonating entire apartment blocks and town squares, erecting the Israeli flag over the wreckage, seeking to re-establish Israeli settlements on the rubble of Palestinian homes, and thus extinguishing the very basis of Palestinian life in Gaza.
Now, I saw through that case very, very quickly. I saw that it was rotten. I saw that it was a complete exoneration of Hamas and of October the 7th.
Because South Africa used this allegation, entirely false allegation of genocide, in one sense as a legal hook to bring Israel to the court, because both Israel and South Africa are party to the Genocide Convention, and it is because they are both signatories of this international convention, this treaty, that the court has ultimately jurisdiction in this case. And we can come on to some of the detail as to why that is. So the first reason that it brought that allegation in the context of the International Court of Justice is as a legal hook to bring Israel to the court. But soon after the first provisional measures order, in January this year, the provisional measures order was on the 26th of January. I was on SABC, which is South Africa's version of the BBC, on the 27th of January. And my counterpart, as we were discussing this development, said, "Isn't it wonderful? Now we can finally use Israel and genocide in the same sentence and nobody can tell us otherwise." And that remark, a throwaway remark as it may have been, really stuck with me and has remained with me since, because it epitomizes exactly what it is that the detractors of Israel, the haters of Jews, are seeking to achieve by alleging this wholly false, unsubstantiatable allegation against Israel. It is to shift the Overton window, the acceptable parameters of debate and discussion here, and to perpetuate. It's important that you reference this being a blood libel.
Gaza's infrastructure has certainly been harmed during the conflict. However, South Africa would have the court believe that Israel is deliberately and unlawfully destroying homes without cause, but harm caused to lawful military objectives and harm caused as a result of Hamas's actions is not evidence of genocide. South Africa also alleges that Israel has waged an assault on Gaza's health system. What South Africa has neglected to bring before the court, however, is the overwhelming evidence of Hamas's military use of such hospitals.
But to most people it changed opinion. It shifted opinion. There were politicians now wondering if they should be involved in supporting Israel. It started a domino effect of more and more world leaders speaking out against Israel. It lent the idea that there was now world authorities were against Israel now, and that the protesters were on the right side of history. And it was making it harder and harder to be seen to defend Israel. And so that's what seemingly began to change public opinion for the worse against Israel. And now, of course, this ICC prosecution has done the same, and it has emboldened the anti-Semites on the left. Now, I think probably the best understanding I've read of anti-Semitism has come from Elika Lebon, Iranian an American Iranian activist who has spoken out about this grotesque, Hamas apologia on the left. Now the thing is, Elika Lebon herself used to be woke, and she used to be part of the Free Palestine crowd, basically.
Did you feel this way about the Israel-Palestine issue before? When you said earlier you were a bit woke?
No. I was pro-Palestine.
You were pro-Palestine?
Yes.
Why were you pro-Palestine?
Because that's just what I believed.
And so it wasn't something you'd necessarily investigated. It was just your instincts were pro-Palestine.
I think it just from a human rights perspective, it was like, and this was something that I didn't understand the full extent of. Of course, I didn't understand the full extent of what was going on back then. But from a human rights perspective, I would just see things online and I'd be like, oh, I'm not okay with this, and that, I believed that their land had been stolen. I believed all of this stuff that I was told, that I was taught. And then I slowly started to research and investigate and learn and speak to experts and academics and read books. And I was like, I think it was then that I started to understand that the way that this had been presented to me it wasn't totally honest. It wasn't a totally honest presentation. I think about the map. The map that is like the map of Palestine, and then it's like the shrinking map of Palestine. And it's like that wasn't totally honest, because I didn't know at that time that there was never a place or a state called Palestine, that this was just a name that the Romans had given to this land that Jews and Arabs were living on.
When that Gaza war in 2021 was happening, she was tweeting in horror of the way that, children were being killed in the war by Israel, and, she even kind of scoffed at the idea that it was anti-Semitic to oppose Israel at the time. Now, Elika's life story, of course, is, although she was born in the West, and her parents did live under the Iranian regime, and, a lot of her family suffered horrifically to the brutality and cruelty of the Iranian regime, the evil cruelty of the Iranian regime. And that's something she will never forgive. Now, October the 7th was significant for her because she knows the kind of cruelty and punishments that the Iranian regime will inflict on dissidents, and particularly women who kind of speak out against the misogynistic practices of Islam. She's known feminist activists in Iran being deliberately blinded by the regime, being raped, imprisoned, raped, beaten and left with brain damage and killed. She knows the kind of horrors of the Islamic regime they inflict on the people. And she knows that Hamas are an Iranian proxy. And so when October the 7th happened, she understood it's the same cruelty that's been inflicted on the Iranian people by the Iranian regime. The rapes, the brutality, the degradation, the sadism, it's the same. It's the same evil, frankly. It's the same evil with kind of this, with, Islamic religious license.
But it was just very, very clear. It's like the Islamic regime in Iran created an Islamic Republic. Hamas wants to create a second Islamic Republic. Hezbollah wants to create a third Islamic Republic. Houthis want, and on and on and on. How do you not see that? How can you be against this Islamic? How can you be saying women life freedom against the Islamic Republic here, but you're supporting the creation of an Islamic Republic pop-up store in different places? It just doesn't make any sense. But they couldn't see it. And that's why, as I said to you, that we would get into this situation where for us, who were clear-eyed from the beginning and throughout, we remained ideologically consistent, right? But for them, they started becoming ideologically inconsistent. And then so they would run into walls anytime they'd make arguments, because they wouldn't be able to be consistent with being anti-regime and pro-Hamas, right? So I don't know. I don't think that their arguments lasted very long, and that's why you don't really hear from them as much.
Yeah, for sure. They're not very they're not very much out there. But sorry, to get back to your point about your article and what you've gone through, I want to give you the opportunity to speak about that.
So at that time, so this Palestinian girl created a video, and she was like, all of you Iranian girlies in freaking California better stop running your mouths about Hamas. They are our resistance. And then the Hamas supporters in the Iranian diaspora, who were all our friends, right? They all started reposting the video. And in the video, in the comment section, it was just doxing us. It was doxing me, my family, doxing my family in Iran, doxing Jewish people in California, doxing their families, their businesses. Like, here's the address of their father's store in Beverly Hills. Go find them. Like scary stuff, And these were the people that, they were our friends in real life reposting this. Good friends, friends that Matthew and I would hang out with and go to events with and have dinners with. They were reposting these videos against us because I can't even explain it. It was like the brain rot, right? Like a virus had infected their brains.
She knew it was the same evil at work, basically. And so when so many of her woke friends cheered on October the 7th and talked about Hamas as being freedom fighters, she was horrified because it felt like in a way they were almost cheering on the regime itself, to her mind. And the more she spoke out against this, the more she was subject to the same abuse that Zionists get from these people. The average, Israeli Zionists get from these people. And, these people will describe anyone as a Zionist. The activists who kind of, held up the Hamas are terrorists sign at the protests.
This is a guy that was holding a placard that said Hamas are terrorists. You can see from this footage that he's furious that he's now being apprehended very aggressively and physically by the police.
I've seen kind of, pro-Palestine activists say, oh, he was just a Zionist. It's like, he's from Iran. He knows how evil the Iranian regime are. This isn't out of any great love for Israel, but it's out of a loathing for Hamas and a loathing for the Iranian regime. But they just say, oh, they don't think like us, they must be a Zionist. They're a Zionist. Now, what Elika realised when she saw just how obsessive the anti-Semitism is and the hatred is, she realised something very kind of disturbing about the pro-Palestine camp. That no matter how the pro-Palestine camp began, whether it was hijacked and infiltrated by this or whether there's just a inevitable cross-pollination of this, any anti-Israel movement is going to inevitably attract anti-Semites whose only agenda is anti-Semitism. Their agenda is to get a vicarious joy out of seeing Palestinian terrorists shedding Jewish blood. That's what's going to draw them to this, and it is an environment that creates comfortable space for sadists who want to see Jewish people, and certainly Israeli people, murdered in cold blood.
I've always been an anti-imperialist by nature. I am against wars of foreign ventures that are foolish and destructive. I was against the Iraq War. I was against the intervention in Afghanistan. I was against the Hillary Clinton-led bombing of Libya in 2011. I've always taken a very strong stance on those kinds of foreign ventures because they are incredibly wasteful, they're incredibly destructive, they usually cause more problems than they solve. In fact, they always do. So I've always had that feeling. But when it comes to Israel, when it has come to the question of people on the streets opposing what they refer to as Israeli warmongering or Israeli imperialism, it has always made me feel incredibly uncomfortable because it has never felt like the anti-war position that I am more familiar with. The anti-war position that I'm more familiar with is a generous one. It's a humanist one. It's one that is concerned for the safeguarding of certain nations, the safeguarding of certain peoples, and the importance of Western powers not splurging so much money and energy and attention on wars and conflicts overseas. It's always been the kind of anti-imperialism I've always stood by, has always taken that kind of approach. But when I've seen anti-Israel protests over the past 20 years, they've always felt so much more bitter and wicked in parts, and ironically pro-war rather than anti-war. So they've always had a tendency of being pro-Hamas or pro-Hezbollah. It was about 15 or 20 years ago that there was a march in London where people were chanting, "We are all Hezbollah." And people openly chant for the destruction of the Jewish state, which is the world's only Jewish state. We've seen that over the past year on the manicured lawns of Columbia University, on British campuses as well, on the streets of our cities. We've seen people calling for the violent destruction, the violent dismantling of the world's only Jewish nation. And I've watched this grow over the past decade or 2 decades, and I've thought, this doesn't feel like anti-imperialism as I've known it. This doesn't feel like an anti-war sentiment. This feels far more elemental and guttural and pro-war and anti-Jewish.
No, I say that, I had no idea how much people hated Jews until I started speaking up for them, and it was like, I think every single person should at one point in their life come out and publicly speak out against anti-Semitism to see what happens to you. Because it's only when you see what happens to you that you understand how bad this is, right? Like the people that are like, oh, anti-Semitism isn't real. It is the biggest form of bigotry on planet Earth. Single-handedly. Like there's nothing else that you can compare. It's so like insidious. It's so deeply buried. It's so intertwined in so many different ideologies, politics, countries. Like it is the most deeply insidious form of bigotry in the world. And unless you come out and speak against it, you don't know. You have to learn the consequences of what happens to you, what happens to your life when you try to defend Jews. And this is how bad it was that my content was so balanced, it wasn't like aggressively taking a political stance. It was just like, hey guys, maybe we shouldn't say, let's gas the Jews. And people were like, you Zionist psycho, I hope that you die. I hope that your family, like.
Yeah, very intense, very intense.
And October the 7th was probably the first time so many of them were so brazen about it, openly and publicly. Inevitably the movement attracts anti-Semites, but the main reason it attracts anti-Semites is because the real agenda beneath it all is nothing to do with Palestine. It's nothing to do with any compassion for the Palestinian people. It is what we've seen. It is this gleeful agenda of the pro-Palestine camp.
So, first of all, London is a very anti-Semitic place. It is, so this is why I say anti-Semitism is so, I always say anti-Semitism is written in invisible ink. You can't see it, but it's there. A lot of the ideologies and the beliefs people have, and you understand this well, the way that anti-Semitism has been able to thrive so well is because it aligns itself with ideologies and soft spots that really trigger people in an emotional place. So if you're talking about a person from this community or that community or this community, you say, okay, Jews are just like white supremacists. Jews are just like slave owners. Jews are just like this. And you build this perception up for not just months, like years, decades, so that a person intrinsically understands that a Jewish person is the same as a slave owner, or just the worst thing that you can imagine. So that when in that final instance, someone comes out and says, I'm just defending Jews, they're like, you have taken the side of the biggest form of evil. And because they've been primed to think that way for so many years, you can't get through to them anymore.
It's this kind of gleeful relish of the idea that what frustrates most anti-Semites is how the Jewish experience is kind of defined by the Holocaust, by the horror of what was done by the Nazis. And it's kind of that the Holocaust is important to the story of the Jews, and it's what's gained them world sympathy, which is something, of course, the anti-Semites resent thoroughly. And what so many of the pro-Palestine camps seem to really relish is the idea that the world seeing the crimes of Israel and the anti-Semitism complaints of the Jewish community, they're gleeful at the thought that the Holocaust has lost its power to horrify people anymore, and that people will now see the Jews as evil, and the Holocaust, they've kind of abused and exhausted the anti-Semitism card, and no one's going to believe them. No one's going to believe their victim act anymore. That's the sinister thinking, and it's this gleeful, nasty agenda that they have, this gleeful, sadistic agenda that so many of these activists have, and it's some of it's people who went in with the movement. Some of it probably is people who went into the movement with that agenda, with no compassion whatsoever in mind for the Palestinians. That was just their agenda. That's what attracted them to the cause. And some of it is a cross-pollination. It's a growing kind of groupthink of the movement. There's a cross-pollination of agendas and ideas about Palestine, and it's like this broad church of, you know, the pro-Palestine movement has brought the worst elements to the top, all agreeing with each other.
So I often think, because, you know, not before October 7th, like I'd say like a little bit before that, like maybe 1 or 2 years before that, you know, when I was more on the other side of things, I always try to go back and think, like, what did I think then? And this is why this is so difficult, because there's like when people will say things like, oh, I was accused of anti-Semitism for just stating facts, right? They're like, it's just a fact that XYZ, that Israel, this. And it's like the reason that they don't understand where the anti-Semitism is because they don't understand that, and part of anti-Semitism is the revision of history. It is the revision. It is the alternative facts. It is cherry picking. It is taking things out of context. And so when I think of like, when I was more on that side, when I was completely on that side of things, and I would hear of something, or if I'd learn about something, it would be like, I never understood why. I'd be like, but why? But why? But why? And I felt like no one really ever explained it to me, right? But it was like just the framing of like, this Israel is the aggressor and it's always the aggressor. And so why would you take the side of the aggressor? And so I think part of the anti-Semitism is in this framing of like, you have the Jewish people who've been persecuted for the past, I mean, more than 2,000 years, but at least, right? And persecuted in every part of the world consistently, expelled from their homeland, subjected to dimitude, minority, inferior status, and somehow throughout this history of persecution, building a theme around the fact that, but they're the aggressor, right? And this is the theme that lives on to this day. Like when they get kicked out of, I don't know, Iraq, right? It's because they're in the money. When they get kicked out of Germany, it's because blah, 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 right? And then up until this day, whatever happens in Israel, it's because of them. And so there is this natural theme of Israel always being the aggressor, or Jews always being the aggressor. And so when someone comes out and they're like, all I said was, right, facts that show Israel is the aggressor, how is that anti-Semitic? And it's like, you literally need like 2,000 years of education to understand.
Yes.
And it's just, you know, the more and more they're resorting to mob rule and attacking Jews, and they're acting on their sick propaganda, their sick anti-Semitism. And when Elika described it like that, it was clear that's what it is. This movement does attract vile anti-Semites, the most sick and disturbed anti-Semites. And it has given them wider permission to be the most vile anti-Semites imaginable. And to kind of to see the Jews as baby killers. Now, the point I actually missed in this was the decolonization of the curriculum. Like I said, the Holocaust dwarfed the Nakba at the time. I think in terms of where it began, in terms of sympathy for the Palestinians, it was long after the Nakba. I think at the time the Nakba was just, it barely met the newspapers. I think the only awareness most British people had of it was maybe a few. There were British soldiers in Palestine who witnessed it, perhaps. But I think even they would probably say that both sides, neither side was better than the other, really. Neither side was better than the other, really, they'd probably say.
The reason I say that they are entirely inverted is that the real victims of each of these allegations have been the Jewish people, especially those in the State of Israel. This concept of occupation before the establishment of the State of Israel, and this goes hand in hand, unfortunately, with colonialism, this is what the British Mandate was for the indigenous Jewish population of Judea. And the notion that Israel would be accused of colonialism is ludicrous when we consider that Israel is the most successful decolonization story. We see this with ethnic cleansing, which essentially papers over the Jewish experience of ethnic cleansing. We only need to look at, after the State of Israel even, the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Judea and Samaria by Jordan in its occupation from 1949 to 1967, the ethnic cleansing of Jews from East Jerusalem, from the old city of Jerusalem, by the Jordanians across that same period of their illegal, if you will, occupation. The ethnic cleansing of Jews from the Arab world, 850,000 expelled from Arab countries, so that so much of the Arab world now is Jew-free. That is the real ethnic cleansing, and yet Israel is being the one accused of it.
But people don't understand that the Middle East is not the West. Like, the Middle East didn't have this, progressive Enlightenment era where they were like, oh, we shouldn't be anti-Semitic and we shouldn't be racist. The Middle East is racist. It's a racist place. And so anti-Semitism continued throughout the Middle East, which is why Jews were expelled from the Middle East. That's why there are still no Jews in the Middle East, right? Aside from Israel and in Iran, ironically. There were various proposals for partition. The 1937 Peel Commission. What people don't talk about is the 1939 White Papers. And under the White Papers, an offer was made to the Arabs that it would be one land, one Palestinian Arab land, under Arab rule, where 75,000 Jewish immigrants were allowed to stay. It would be subject to Arab rule, government, everything. They would have to allow Jewish immigration to increase, but it was totally at the discretion of the Arabs, and they rejected it.
Huh.
No partition, because they said we won't have Jews on this land.
Huh.
And they still want to say that this is about the land belonging to Palestine or Arabs or whatever they want to say, when this is a land that we know was ancestrally Jewish land, a land that didn't belong to anybody at the time that states were being formed, a land that Jews and Arabs were both living on, a land that there was even a proposal that you wouldn't partition it and it would be entirely an Arab land. And in the height of the Holocaust and the height of anti-Semitism around the world, of course the answer was no, which is exactly why they were being kicked out from everywhere else. And it's exactly the same reason why this war continues today.
It was more the years that the refugee crisis obviously continued to be perpetuated by UNRWA and the UN that I think, more and more sympathy was drawn to the Palestinians by the Western left. Especially after the 1967 war, the growth of the PLO, this appeal to a lot of leftists, the PLO ideology appealed to a lot of Western leftists. Some in Germany even collaborated with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, like the Entebbe hijacking in the 70s.
Everybody, this is a hijack situation! No!
We've got weapons and bombs. If you try anything, you will die.
We call upon revolutionary movements everywhere
to focus the attention of the world on the Palestinian people's struggle.
Welcome to Entebbe, Uganda.
Then in the 80s, of course, there was the Lebanon War, and the horrors in Lebanon, I think, is what began to draw more and more. It kind of provoked more world horror at Israel. Various events have kind of led more and more people to be horrified at Israel of late. But I think the Nakba was something that a lot of people weren't aware of, and I think with this move to decolonize the curriculum, there is, it seems, this nasty anti-Semitic agenda to convince the students that the Nakba should never have been overlooked, and it's because of colonialism that it got overlooked. It's because of Israel's colonial ambitions that it got overlooked. And like, with this culture of decolonizing the institutions, it was almost like telling them, forget what you were told about the Holocaust and look at what the Holocaust obscured about the Jews being just as bad, the Zionists being just as bad, what was done to the Palestinians being just as bad. So decolonize the curriculum has actually become, in a horrific way, stop seeing the Jews as victims. The Jews should never be allowed to use the Holocaust as cover for the Nakba. You know, the students should be taught that the Nakba was a Holocaust committed by the Jews. And basically to decolonize the idea that the Holocaust was the worst horror the Jews suffered and the Jews are victims. It's now to kind of try and decolonize the curriculum and teach them about, you know, that about the victims of colonialism and the victims of Jewish colonialism as well. That's been the agenda, and that I think is what has been driving this, in a way, this move to take away the power of the Holocaust. And we've even got kind of traitor capo Jews like Norman Finkelstein who are behind this cause. And it's a sick cause.
Let me go to Norman Finkelstein. Norman, the question I would have for you is this. Do you accept that Hamas need to be removed from power in Gaza?
I would say that the preeminent, I would say that the preeminent question at the present moment ought to be, do I accept the fact that the Israeli government ought to be removed from power? And should Hamas remain in power, I think that the Palestinian people should be able to determine their own future and determine their leadership.
It is disgusting that Norman Finkelstein uses his late parents to defame Israel, to pretend that Israel are the Nazis in this situation. All societies produce sick individuals, but very few people have been produced who are quite as sick as Norman Finkelstein.
Would you ever debate with him?
I said to you, I refuse, and I refuse for one straightforward reason, is that I know very, very few people I would say I don't debate with. But Norman Finkelstein is one of them. Most people I know in academia stopped having anything to do with him many decades ago, when he wrote his book, The Holocaust Industry, in 2000, claiming that the Jews were using the Holocaust to sort of make money from and so on. Most people wanted to be nowhere near such a fetid individual.
But it's decolonized the curriculum, it's happening, and this is the result. We're seeing a rise in horrific anti-Semitism and glorification of, you know, Muslim, Islamic tribal hatreds of the Jews here in Britain. And it might be that Corbyn warned us in advance that this problem was on the left. But now the left are kind of back with a vengeance and looking at Gaza and thinking, if only we could have had Corbyn in charge. And why didn't we get Corbyn in charge? Because of the the conspiracies of the Zionist lobby to have him branded as an evil anti-Semite. And now we're just not interested in that, you know, that con anymore, that scam anymore. The Jews are to blame for it. The Zionists are to blame for it. And we should never listen to them again. And we should just act with impunity. We should act like we don't care. So the left has been worse. Academia has been worse. Academia has gotten worse. and it's breeding more and more generations of embittered leftists who follow all the worst trends. Now, how is this going to change? That's the problem. If the police don't allow us to do much in the way of demonstration against, if the only news channels discussing the truth about what's happening in Israel are the right-wing fringe channels like GB News and Talk TV that are actually under attack from Ofcom and from politically correct do-gooder activists, and more people are watching Al Jazeera these days because after the Iraq War so many people became so disillusioned with Western media that they thought that Al Jazeera offered a kind of more accurate account of the Iraq War, even though Al Jazeera is just someone else's, just some other country's propaganda channel. And of course the universities are getting a lot of Qatari funding to spread this destructive ideology, this destructive propaganda. What can we do? I'm back to square one, really. There's not much I can do. I've got a lot going on my plate at the moment in terms of my family life, family crisis. And I've barely got the time to do the videos I do, or to even venture into the town centre to make any kind of challenge to any of this madness. I don't have the time in my personal life to affect change any other way than making videos like this. And I feel very sad about that. I feel awful about it, really. I don't know what we can do. The only thing we can wait on is, the only thing we can do is wait for a miracle, I suppose. Wait for some kind of miracle. I don't have the time to even make changes in my life to get more active and involved at the moment. I've just got far too much on my plate. And I feel awful about it. I'm so sick of it. Sick of the way things are. But I don't know what I can do about it. The only thing I know to do is wait on a miracle. Wait for this tide of madness to be reversed by people with power. Trump seems to be the best hope. I don't know what else to do except put out videos like this to raise awareness of what we're up against. And hopefully someone can find tools to fight this evil propaganda war. Somewhere in there. Anyway, I'm sorry this one's such a downer, but I'm feeling very down, frankly. This is what anti-Semitism does. It makes us all feel inadequate. It makes us all feel like we've failed. Makes us feel like we can't do anything against the tide of madness. This is what anti-Semitism does. And it is written in an invisible ink. And before you know it, it has exploded into mainstream society in a way that we all thought and hoped was buried. And now we know better, sadly.
We've spoken to more than 20 Labour Party officials, including many of those at party headquarters employed to deal with anti-Semitism. One by one, they left, with Kat Buckingham the first of the disputes team to go in December 2016.
I was stuck between an angry and obstructive leader's office and an arcane disciplinary system. And I couldn't stop the problem. I couldn't hold the tide. And I felt so powerless and I felt guilty and I felt like I'd failed. And yeah, I had a breakdown.
Did you?
Yeah, I quit the party with nowhere to go. And yeah, I had a breakdown. It was too much pain from too many people.
Right.
Not just personal. It was I felt keenly that there was a huge community impact. People felt it was okay to make people feel unwelcome in their community. It's not okay.
This is what anti-Semitism does. It's a hell for decent people. It's an unending hell for decent people when this frenzy explodes as it does and runs as rampant as it has for the last year. And I dread this is only the beginning. I'm going to close up by reading a small passage from Brendan O'Neill's After the Pogrom. After the Pogrom by Brendan O'Neill. This is the introduction. The 8th of October 2023 ought to have been a day of shining moral clarity for humankind. In the preceding 24 hours, something terrible had occurred. Something almost unimaginable. A thing that felt like it belonged to the last century, to the century of war and extermination intruded into ours. Atavistic hatreds leapt from the pages of the history books. An orgy of killing of the kind we had previously only seen in black and white photos and sanitized Hollywood films unfolded in real time. The past invaded the present. The pogrom returned. Hamas and other Islamist groups invaded Israel to murder Jews. They moved with extreme prejudice through the kibbutzim and deserts of the south of Israel. No one was spared. Not children, not women, not the elderly. Rockets were fired at moving cars. Grenades were thrown into bomb shelters in which families had taken refuge. A music festival was turned into a slaughter zone. What had been a joyous gathering of youth under the spell of trance music became a site of rape and murder. 364 souls were extinguished there. The numbers are grim. More than 1,100 people were killed in total, 796 of them civilians. 250 were taken hostage. They included 3-year-old twins and an 85-year-old grandmother. Yet even the death toll, as much as it chills the soul, fails to capture the full horror of the day. It was the sadism of the violence, the glee in it that ought to have awoken the world's conscience. They filmed their barbarism and shared it online. They took pride in their bloodbath. One pogromist phoned home to boast to his parents about how many Jews he had killed. They dragged their bruised, bloodied hostages back to Gaza and paraded them in the streets. The broken body of a young woman who had been raving just hours earlier was jeered at, spat on, beaten with sticks. It echoed the annihilations of old. A violence we no longer thought possible, the pogrom we thought was the stuff of museums, brutally imprinted itself on our complacent sanctuary. Hamas had fulfilled the promise of its founding covenant, which was to kill Jews. This was more than terrorism. It was more than mass murder. It was a total derailment from civilization, in the words of German novelist Herta Müller. The Jewish nation found itself subject to the very butchery it was built to withstand. The state to which Jews fled to escape the pogroms was now besieged by a pogrom. It felt like the most grave of violations, both of the sanctuary of the Jews and of the pact humankind made in the aftermath of that last great war. Never again. And yet that shining moral clarity never came. Israel waited in vain for the young and the educated of the West to rally to its side. Few here seem to appreciate the enormity of what had occurred, the challenge it posed not only to the Jewish state but also to humanity in its entirety. Hamas had not only tested Israel's territorial security but also mankind's moral conscience. It laid down a gauntlet alongside its grenades. It dared us to pit our civilization against its barbarism. It dared us to pit our civilization against its barbarism. It dared us to be decisive. And we failed. The lucidity of moral thought that this atrocious moment called for was shockingly absent. The marshalling of the human spirit against the pogromists failed to materialize. The world's conscience slept. Instead, people talked about context as if there could ever be a context for fascist murder. People said it was Israel's own fault for mistreating the Palestinians, as if a pogrom is a legitimate response to grievance. People made excuses for evil. Worse, people celebrated. In the immediate aftermath of the carnage, people took to the streets of London, Berlin, Sydney, not to sympathise with the Jews, but to laud their killers. Fuck the Jews, they said in Sydney. I support the attack 100%, said a protester in London. Long live the 7th of October, said a banner in New York City. Sympathy for Hamas exploded on our campuses. Admiration for its terror was hollered on our streets. A dawning, chilling realization came. Too many had taken up the cause, not of the Jews, but of their persecutors. The 7th of October was primarily a day of horror and grief for Israelis. It was the worst attack the modern state of Israel has experienced in its 76 years of existence. But it was a moral test too. It was a moral test for the world. Many books will be written about the Israel-Hamas war and the future of Israel after October the 7th. But that's what this book is about. Why we failed this moral test. And what we might do to ensure we never fail a test like this again. That's the kind of sickness we're dealing with here, and I need to be braver. But what can you do when the world has gone insane and is not cooperating with your voice of sanity anymore? What can you do? What do you do? What do I do? I don't know anything else to do at the moment except continue making videos. Continue spreading awareness when I have the time. Amidst the family crisis that's dragging out this last half a year. Since my mum's nervous breakdown. I don't really have answers of what to do. I need to get myself into a good state where I can make challenge, but I don't have the time. I've got far too much on my plate at the moment. I suppose we all do, and this is what the modern world has done. It's preoccupied us all with, the cost of living crisis, so many crises we have to deal with, whilst the activists enjoy a free rein to spread the most toxic, warped, pro-terrorist propaganda with the license of their own conscience, as it were. I'm sick of this. Sick of this country. I feel very helpless, and it's an awful feeling to feel. Making videos is all I can do. It's all any of us can do, it seems, at this time, in these times. We have to understand what we're fighting here. That's the most important thing. A shape-shifting evil that plays on people's pity and sensitivity and compassion, exploits them to an evil anti-Semitic agenda, an evil hatred of the Jews. And it's gaining more and more impressionable recruits. It's even gaining the sympathy of world leaders. These times are evil. And we need a hero. We need a miracle. And we need it soon. When all else fails, all I seem able to do is pray. Pray for a miracle. Anyway, this is Sadako24, signing out.
Mother gave you life, you know she trusted you, but you killed one of her angels. How could you, how could you? Gave you everything, probably more than you would do. Then you turned your back on her. How could you, how could you? Killed a little angel cause you're scared of letting love be lived. Killed a little angel cause you're scared. Can't make it right with me. Now it's out of my hands. God don't love you no more. No more, no more. Can't ask for help from me. Now it's out of my hands. God don't love you no more. No more, no more. No, 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 no more. No, 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 no more. No, 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 no more. Satan spilling out of your pores. Can't make it. God don't love you more. Didn't have to be this way. You could have thought it through, but you shut off all your senses when you do what you do. Slowly caving inward like a flower wilts. So I hope there's something to be built from all of your guilt. Filled with all that darkness cause you're scared of being filled with love. Filled with all that darkness cause you're scared. Can't make it right with me. Now it's out of my hands. God don't love you no more. Oh, can't ask for help from me. Now it's out of my hands. God don't love you no more. No more, no more. Pray, mother. Pray, mother. Pray. no more. Don't ask for shit from me. Nah, it's out of my hands. God, don't love you no more. No more, no more. No, 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 no more. No, 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 no more. No, 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 no more. Satan's spilling out of your door. Pray to